Welcome to Order Militarist Radio TV. We're lifelong Catholics, and what we do is all for free and for our love of Jesus Christ and for our Holy Mother, the Church. We'll defend our Holy Mother, the Church. Today we're going to tell you the real history of how the Soviet Union fell. And no, it doesn't, and McDonald's had nothing to do with it. So we welcome Brother Alexis back to the program.
Thank you, AJ, for having me on Order Militaris Radio TV and for doing this wonderful investigation. And before we begin, we want everyone to know where we get our information from, that we're not just making this up out of whole cloth. So, AJ, show the book, Putin's People, and who's the author?
Catherine Belleton.
And she was an investigative journalist who visited Moscow many years, and she drew on her knowledge of her entire career, 20, 30 years, to compile this book, which is a real tome of information for people who don't know what's going on in Russia and want to actually know the truth, rather than just let their minds be played like, a wet noodle by Russian propaganda memes that they see on Twitter. So this program, like all the programs on Order Militaris Radio TV, is for the people who want to know the truth and are intelligent enough to ask detailed questions. So, I am old enough to remember that when the wall came down in '89, it was just like a mass free-for-all of joy. It was like, the Cold War is ending? This is amazing. There were hordes of people at the Berlin Wall, jumping up and down, taking pieces of it, tearing it down. It was like the beginning of a new age. It was like the end of a great dark age of fear. We're all living in fear of being, nuclear war at any time. I remember that was as a kid. And then maybe 10 years passed, and all of a sudden you got these Russian dissidents coming out, these ex-military or ex-KGB, and saying, wait a minute, it didn't happen. You've been all fooled. And no one or hardly anyone believed them. Mm-hmm. So this is what our program's today. So did the Soviet Union fall, or did it get transformed, really? Was it to something else? So AJ's done the research, and so let's start answering those questions. We won't tell you the answer to the end of the program, to show you that we're not making this up. We're not just going to tell you an opinion and just lay it all out. So the Soviet Union was collapsing. Corruption was becoming rife. The Cold War competition that Ronald Reagan geared up by his vast spending on U.S. military was just like overwhelmed the Russians. They couldn't keep compete. So what was happening in the economy, and who were cooperative owners, and what role did they have in Russia?
Yeah. The owners were Artyom Tarasov, the Soviet Union's first publicly declared ruble millionaire, publicly campaigned against it and won the support of half the Politburo, including Alexander Yakovlev and former KGB chief Viktor Shabryakov. Gorbachev have always wanted a gradual reform that would keep the economy within the confines of the socialist state. But now, in the rush for riches, the unity of the party leadership itself was cracking, with a deepening rift between progressives and the old guard conservatives.
Now, I heard you say Gorbachev. Are we talking about the famous politician everyone knows? Okay. So how did Boris Yeltsin come into the scene of this? What role did he play, and how did he get his entrance?
Yeah, so one by one, the progressives were giving their support to Boris Yeltsin, the upstart former member of the Politburo, who was increasingly challenging Gorbachev's rule, and members of the KGB secretly joined them. Yeltsin had gained a platform as a leader in his own right under Gorbachev's own political reforms. First, when he was elected chairman of Russia's Supreme Soviet in 1990, and then when he was elected president of the Russian Federation in the first such elections in June 1991.
Okay, and Boris Yeltsin is the guy who recruited Vladimir Putin, so this is a name to watch. And so who joined Yeltsin and served at his side during his time as president of the Russian Federation.
The handpicked new young wolves of Russia's economic transition were rallying behind Yeltsin, while reform-minded political giants such as Alexander Yakovlev moved to his side too. Kotodorsky and his team financed part of Yeltsin's presidential election bid, helping to run part of his media campaign and forging ties deep within his administration.
Okay. And now I remember there was this event, I forget what year it was. There was this like attempted coup against Boris Yeltsin. When did that happen? What happened? Was it a coup?
So parts of the KGB never seemed to support the hardline coup. The plotters had declared that the KGB chief, Vladimir Kuchikov, was with them, but Kuchikov stepped back from taking decisive action to quash protests against the coup. The KGB didn't arrest Yeltsin when he landed back in Moscow from Kakistan the morning after the plotters took control, nor did the elite KGB special unit, the Alpha troops, detain him as they lurked in the bushes outside his Moscow dacha while he mulled over his next steps. Instead, Yeltsin was able to make his way, unhindered, to the White House, the seat of the Russian parliament power, where he led a defiant protest against the coup as tens of thousands flocked to support him. When the plotters finally gave the orders to storm Yeltsin's stronghold on the afternoon of the third day of the coup, the Alpha troops declined to fire on the White House. Kuchikov withdrew the order when 3 men were killed in the early hours of the morning, after a group of protesters had barricaded a nearby street from incoming tanks. No one wanted to spill any more blood.
So why did the KGB support this coup?
Yeah. So the progressives in the party and the KGB had clearly begun to back the Democratic leaders because they didn't want the flood of cash to stop. Part of the KGB supported Yeltsin, said Andrei Eleronov, an economic advisor to Putin in the first years of his presidency. They saw Yeltsin as an alternative who could carry out market reform. All
Okay.
about the Benjamins.
Now, what goes on to happen on August 19th, 1991?
Yeah, that one. So when Boris Yeltsin, blinking in the sunlight, strode out of the Russian White House in the middle of the hardline coup on the afternoon of August 19, 1991, the world believed it had gained an icon for a new age. Defying the military hardware surrounding the White House, Yeltsin clambered stiffly on top of one of the tanks, shaking the hands of the soldiers manning its guns as he went. In the euphoric days that followed, a symbol of the KGB's overpowering might, a statue of the founding father of the Soviet secret police, Felix Drisky, was winched away from its place in front of the KGB headquarters on Moscow's Lubyanka Square. Western bankers and government officials were soon hurrying to Russia to advise Yeltsin's new government on the creation of a market economy. The new cabinet was partly staffed with bright young economists, including Yegor Gadar and Pyotr Avin. Russia was to integrate into Western markets, and a new era of cooperation was hailed.
And I remember that propaganda. That was the fall before I joined the Franciscan Friars of the Immaculate and put aside this world. So we were all convinced that the KGB had been overthrown and that finally their last gasp of their evil claw had come to an end. Boy, so what didn't turn out that way? What happened in 2 months later in October of 1999? What really happened to the KGB?
Yeah. Although in October 1991, Yeltsin signed an order abolishing the KGB and breaking it up into 4 different domestic services, his appointment of Vladimir Putin to head the organization in the final months before its breakup was an early sign that change was going to be cosmetic. Bakutin was an experienced outsider who served briefly as interior minister in the final years of the Soviet regime, and his new KGB comrades ran rings around him. He himself admitted to the Moscow journalist Yevgeny Albats that he had little control over his employees, that he knew they were manipulating him and withholding information from him. I'm absolutely convinced that whatever the Komichekchi don't want me to know, I won't know, he told her. And once the KGB had officially been broken up under Primakov's stewardship, the powerful Foreign Intelligence Service, now renamed the SVR, remained intact, even though tens of thousands apparently demoralized officers resigned from the service to join the rush into business. Part of the system merely went underground, like Putin with Sobchak. They stayed in the shadows, said one former intermediary for the KGB, speaking on condition of anonymity. They didn't really get rid of anything. They changed the facade, they changed the name, but nothing else really changed. While officially the SVR's budget was shredded, unofficial sources of funding were soon found.
Okay, so how did the new prime minister find funds?
Yeah, could you talk a little bit? I'm going to go. You.
Okay, so as we can see, this totally disassembles the whole narrative we're fed that Russia converted, okay? Because John Paul II consecrated it back in the 80s. That was like 83 or 85, so 82. And when there's grace, not only exterior, but internal changes take place. It's not just cosmetic changes. If it's just cosmetic changes, well, then it's not real conversion. It's not real change. It's just a theatrical act of deception. And this is what happened in the fall of 1991 that most people in the West didn't realize, and only now, long after. This is why Putin is the autocrat of Russia, because he is KGB. And if you have any common sense, you realize, well, they weren't defeated, they actually won.
Yeah, so the funds that the new prime minister found. Oh boy.
Now, by the prime minister, do we mean Boris Yeltsin or his?
Yegor Gadar, that economist guy, made sure to find funds to maintain strategic outposts for the foreign intelligence. One such payment was $200 million in 1992 to Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba for the Russian Foreign Intelligence Services to continue to use its Lord's listening station for eavesdropping on the U.S. The payment was made through a convoluted barter scheme, swapping oil products for sugar imports, exactly like the smuggling schemes deployed by the KGB through friendly firms. The $200 million transfer was made at the same time as Russia's official state budget for 1992 was $148 million. Later that year, Gadyer diverted an entire $1 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund aimed at stabilizing the Russian economy to bail out one of the most important financial outposts of Russia's foreign intelligence network, Eurobank, the Soviet state bank in Paris.
So this is like utter corruption. I remember in those years, there were these economists saying, why is Russia paying Cuba these outrageous prices for sugar? And here you go. This is how they were covering the bribe. $200 million to loan a listening station. That's a pretty high rent. It's probably $100 a square foot, even higher, you know. So, but to take an international monetary fund loan and redirect it to save one of your banks that's pushing your intelligence network in Europe. If anyone in the International Monetary Fund didn't figure that out, then, you know, connect the dots. International Monetary Fund is skull and bones. Skull and Bones financing Russian intelligence. Why would they be doing that unless the real enemy is us and not them? I mean, us meaning the people and not the two enemies of one another. So how did now these new tycoons get so filthy rich?
Yeah. So let's see. Make sure I got this right here. Following my notes here. Okay, so the tycoons also benefited from the next planned market reform of the Gaydar government, the privatization of state enterprises. The only people with funds to participate in the so-called mass privatization were the narrow elite who had already taken over much of the enterprises. Cash flowed under Gorbachev's, oh boy, I'm going to butcher this, perestroika,
Perestroika.
reforms.
Perestroika.
The young businessmen from the Komostal, the black marketeers, the organized crime groups, the KGB, and the state directors. The privatization at the time of hyperinflation could only further concentrate the country's wealth in the hands of the small group, said Grigor Yavlinsky, one of Russia's most principled economists, who argued strongly for more gradual reforms. How is it possible to have privatization when money has been wiped out as an institution? There could only be a criminal privatization. The next step was criminal privatization.
So in these years, the old Russian ruble just became like worthless overnight. I mean, it went from being a couple to the dollar to like thousands to the dollar. And their savings were all wiped out. And Yeltsin reissued a new currency, and their old rubles you had to bring in, and all the people who were tax evading couldn't hide all this money they've been hiding in your apartment. So yeah, obviously, if you're going to start selling state industries in a time when no one has money, then you're not really giving them to people outside of the elite that already control the country.
It goes further. The government was being bled dry while the new wolves of the Russian economy concocted elaborate schemes to avoid paying taxes or custom duties. Faster and more adept in ways of the market than their one-time masters in the KGB, the young tycoons from the Komsomol were becoming a sort of Frankenstein's monster, fast outrunning the men who had made them. The real turning point, when control of the economy appeared to transfer irrevocably into the hands of the new tycoons, came towards the middle of 1995. Russia was entering the final year before the first post-Soviet presidential elections, and the government's coffers were simply empty. Wages and pensions were months in arrears, and Yeltsin's approval rating were terrifying low at 6%. Tycoons feared a return to communism that would strip them of their fortunes and could even land them in jail. Even more importantly, they long been eyeing the crown jewels of the Soviet industry, the state's biggest industrial giants. What they acquired so far was small scale compared to vast resources still under the control of the state.
Okay, so here we see a repeat of what happens in the Bolshevik Revolution. Trotsky said, the Bolshevik Revolution was to loot Russia. And the declaration of the end of the Soviet Union was nothing other than a vast looting of the Soviet Union. And so the markets are beginning to change. We'll go from a complete state-controlled economy to a somewhat free market. And exactly what's going on in Russia now, AJ.
So now we get into the bankers. Vladimir Putin, the smooth-talking son of a senior Soviet diplomat, who became one of the country's major new bankers, concocted what seemed an ingenious scheme. He proposed that the young bankers offer to help out the cash-strapped Yeltsin government with a series of loans. As collateral, the tycoons would take stakes in a select handful of the nation's biggest enterprises. The tycoons would manage the enterprises and could sell off their stakes if the government was unable to pay the loans back. When the idea was first floated, outside observers scoffed that it would never gain any traction. The potential for corruption, they said, was too great. It would be too easy for the bankers simply to sell the stakes to themselves.
And who are these new bankers?
Well, that Vladimir Putin. Then prime among them was Anatoly Chubas, the red-haired deputy prime minister and close Gatter ally who had been architect of the privatization program so far. With strong support from a team of U.S. economists, Chubas had been intent on breaking the hold of the state over the economy at any cost. Too much of the industry was still in the hands of the state of Red Soviet-era directors and the KGB, while the threat of the return of communism seemed all too real. If the government signed off on the banker's proposal, it would create a major new class of property owners overnight, as well as filling empty government coffers with a proposed $1.8 billion in loan. The tycoons would then back Yeltsin to the hilt against communists to preserve the new wealth. Chubas believed it would signal a final victory for the liberal reformers over the forces of the old guard.
Yeah, because they're gonna, for 1.8 billion, they were probably buying 1.8 trillion in assets. So this was like, pennies on the thousands. And now, you want to add?
And one of the major things that they were going after was the controlling stake in the world's biggest producer of nickel and platinum. Norilsk Nickel was sprawling plant high above the Arctic Circle, whose profits in 1995 stood at $1.2 billion.
So they're going to loan 1.8 to get control of 1.2 billion in inflow. That's a really good investment.
Yo,
So who truly owns these new oligarchs of Russia who bought all the state economy for pennies on the dollar and now are fabulously wealthy?
So, right. By the end of the 90s, the young tycoons are starting to turn around the Soviet legacy of falling production, deep debts, and neglect, but for the members of the security services that helped create these new billionaires. The loans for shares auction was a moment they would never forgive or forget, and would be the kernel for the KGB's later revanche. Before then, in the shadows, the KGB men had still been able to control much of the cash flow from the nation's oil wealth, but now they've been outwitted and outpaced, and the financial reins had largely been taken out of their hands. This was the turning point when the young tycoons took control, said Rare Simon, the ally of the Yevgeny Primakov, who worked on the early perestroika reforms. It changed the entire paradigm. But in those days, the tycoons of Russia, New Order, were giddy at their new wealth. They were fast becoming oligarchs who held considerable sway over the weakened Yeltsin government. The remaining members of the old guard security services who had served in government had been ousted amid scandal in the run-up in the presidential elections, and Western-leaning reformers like Chubas had been left to take the lead. Fresh from his successful engineering of the loans for shares sell-off, Putin took a post at Yeltsin's deputy prime minister. Borisovsky was appointed secretary of the Secretary Council. Chubas became Yeltsin's chief of staff. It was the apotheosis of their era. The country, it seemed, was theirs. The forces of the KGB appeared to be receding into the background. But said the former senior foreign intelligence operative Yuri Shevets, the oligarchs all forgot to whom they owed a debt. In the rush to shore up their positions, in the battle to accumulate more wealth, Kordovsky and the others didn't notice that nearby, in St. Petersburg, there was a chill in the air. Things were being run differently there. Isolated from the gold rush and Moscow's economic boom, the forces of the KGB were exerting far greater control in a city where the economy was tougher, darker, and the violent scrabble for cash.
And that kind of ends where our show on Putin's rise to power, the first show we began, because St. Petersburg was seen in this era as the place for foreigners to come to invest. And they invested in all these companies and their assets were stolen by the KGB. And who was the ringleader? It was Vladimir Putin. Well, he was actually the front man for the whole operation. So who does Yeltsin name as his successor? Perhaps as a way of getting back at these young tycoons that took over his government and brought up the whole economy. He brings in Vladimir Putin, and Vladimir Putin has a lot of money behind him from the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab, who had already recruited him. So now we can answer our question: did the Soviet Union fall? What would you say, AJ?
It didn't fall.
Yeah.
It made the appearances that it fell, but behind the scenes, it remained the same.
I would use this comparison. It was kind of like an infection. So democracy and liberty infected, raised the fever, and it looks like the old Soviet Union would die, but at the last moment, the KGB antibodies snuck in there and squelched it all down and slowly took control of it back. And this is who runs Russia today. It's the KGB, called the FSB, which is called Vladimir Putin and his group. And they slowly put the oligarchs under their control, even though there are oligarchs in Russia that still call the shots. And I'll just point out that the oligarchs in Russia today that have the wealth, we're not talking about Russians. They're nearly all Jews, okay? They might be godless Jews, but they're not Russian Orthodox. So that's the facts about Russia. And that's why when the foreign minister of Russia said that Zelensky is like Hitler because they're both Jews, and Israel went crazy saying, how dare you call Hitler a Jew? Putin himself intervened and corrected Lavrov within 36 hours. So the old saying is, who rules the world is who you can't criticize. Vladimir Putin fears someone up above him who is Jewish. Okay, so, and who would that be? You know, so like anything else, the Russian state bank is part of the Bank of International Settlement System, which is a Rothschild-controlled entity. So if you think Russia is independent state and that the whole system of control built up by the Rothschilds, the Bolsheviks, skull and bones, that is represented by the KGB just evaporated overnight and now it's a free country, then you're going to have a hard time explaining why Vladimir Putin's running the country and why he makes apologies about Adolf Hitler being Jewish. Because as a matter of fact, Adolf Hitler's genetics show that he was Jewish by blood, but that doesn't mean he was raised as a Catholic and he didn't profess the Jewish religion. We'll cite that out. But a lot of people in Austria have Jewish blood and descent. I think even Pope Benedict on a distant grandmother side, because a lot of Jews of the centuries have converted. But so if you play with the meaning of the word Jewish, you can make those claims and they're just equally true. So thank you, AJ, for having me on this program on did the Soviet Union really collapse? And now we understand better why Russia needs to convert and has not converted. And as long as Putin and his men are in power, there's no sign of conversion in Russia. Quite the contrary.
Yeah. So please like and share this program. It'll be uploaded to the radio website. It'll also be on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute. Yep, that's it. And so stay tuned for the next one. Day is full.
Day is full.